Giovanni Gentile's life was one of deep conflict, a man who grew up on the fringes of Italian society, striving for unity and strength in a fractured nation, only to become one of the key architects of its authoritarian downfall. Born in Sicily in 1875, a region long regarded as backward and marginalized, Gentile knew what it felt like to be cast aside. Sicily, and southern Italy as a whole, was often viewed by the more prosperous northern regions as a burden. Gentile's early years were marked by Italy's political instability, where regionalism and poverty bred division rather than unity. This deeply shaped his worldview and would later drive his commitment to the idea that the state, not the individual, was the source of strength and identity. But this drive toward collectivism didn't happen overnight. As Gentile studied philosophy, he was particularly drawn to the work of Hegel, whose concept of dialectical synthesis seemed to offer a way forward for a divided Italy. Hegel's idea that contradictions could only be resolved through their reconciliation into a greater whole spoke to Gentile's yearning for unity. In his eyes, the tension between individualism and collectivism needed to be resolved in favor of the collective, only then could Italy find stability. From this foundation, Gentile would go on to develop actual idealism, a philosophy that posited that reality was shaped by thought, and the state was the highest expression of collective human will. This deep conviction that Italy's fragmentation could only be overcome by placing the state above all else led Gentile to his intellectual and political alliance with Benito Mussolini. Italy, at the time, was a country on the edge, reeling from its humiliating experience in World War I, politically fractured and economically devastated. Liberal democracy appeared weak and ineffectual. To Gentile, Mussolini represented the strong, decisive leadership that could unify the nation. In Mussolini, Gentile saw an opportunity to put his theories into practice, to realize his vision of a collective state that transcended the selfishness of individualism. But here lies the tragic irony of Gentile's life. His sincere desire to bring Italy together, to create a sense of national unity, drove him down a path where individual freedoms were crushed under the weight of the state. Gentile's philosophy, which sought to resolve Italy's divisions, ultimately led to a regime that silenced dissent, imprisoned political opponents, and suppressed free thought. As Minister of Education from 1922 to 1924, Gentile's reforms fundamentally reshaped Italian education. Schools no longer existed to foster independent thinkers, but to create obedient citizens who would serve the state. To educate a person without a sense of the collective is to leave him isolated, Gentile declared. His educational reforms removed any space for critical thought or intellectual diversity, turning Italy's classrooms into indoctrination centers where loyalty to Mussolini and the state was the ultimate goal. Winston Churchill observed, "No one did more than Giovanni Gentile to ensure that the minds of Italy's youth were aligned with the needs of the fascist state." Yet Gentile was not just an educational reformer. His belief in the supremacy of the state extended into every facet of Italian life. He believed that state-directed capitalism was the ideal way to organize the economy, where private businesses would exist, but only to serve the collective interests of the state. Mussolini's government, following Gentile's philosophical lead, controlled industry and the economy to ensure that all efforts were focused on strengthening the nation. Dissent, whether political or economic, was seen as a threat to this unity and was swiftly suppressed. Gentile's ideas provide a clear case study in how collectivism, when pushed to its extreme, can justify authoritarianism. The very core of actual idealism, the idea that reality is shaped by thought, with the state as the highest expression of collective will, undermines individual autonomy. When the state is seen as the embodiment of moral truth, there is no room for dissent or personal freedom. The individual is absorbed into the collective, and any challenge to the state's authority is seen not just as opposition, but as an existential threat. In Mussolini's Italy, this philosophy provided the intellectual justification for brutal repression. The Blackshirts, Mussolini's paramilitary enforcers, silenced political opposition through violence and intimidation. Thousands of Italians were imprisoned or executed for speaking out against the regime, and the press was tightly controlled to ensure that only pro-state narratives were published. For Gentile, this repression was not an unfortunate side effect, but a necessary step in building a unified nation. In his mind, the collective good outweighed any concerns about individual liberty. But what of today? While the authoritarian extremes of fascist Italy may seem far removed from modern democracies, the idea of prioritizing the collective over the individual continues to manifest in subtle ways. Consider the modern push for increased regulation of online speech. Governments and organizations today argue for tighter control over digital platforms to combat what is deemed misinformation, hate speech, and extremism. While these efforts are framed as necessary to protect public discourse and social harmony, critics warn of the risks of overreach. When platforms like Facebook and Twitter hold the power to decide what speech is acceptable, there is a danger that legitimate voices will be silenced in the name of maintaining social order. This mirrors Gentile's belief that dissenting views threatened the unity of the state and thus needed to be suppressed. Another parallel can be drawn in the debate over state-controlled healthcare. Policies like Medicare for All are often promoted as ways to address inequalities and provide access to essential services. And while the intentions are admirable, there is a risk in centralizing such a critical aspect of society under government control. Expanding state power, even for noble causes, can erode personal choice and autonomy over time. The challenge is to pursue social equality without sacrificing individual liberties, a balance that Gentile's philosophy was unable, or unwilling, to strike. A modern parallel to Gentile's philosophy of state control can be found in the increasing calls for government regulation or nationalization of big tech companies. In the US, voices have pushed for greater control over major tech platforms like Google, Amazon, and Facebook, arguing that these corporations hold too much power over public discourse, data privacy, and the economy. Proposals for breaking up these companies or bringing them under tighter government regulation reflect concerns about corporate overreach, but critics argue that this could give the state excessive control over key sectors of the economy and the flow of information. This parallels Gentile's belief in state-directed capitalism, where industries were allowed to exist but had to ultimately serve the state's interests. The challenge today lies in balancing the regulation of powerful corporations with the protection of personal freedoms and market independence, avoiding the risk of state overreach in the process. Gentile's tragic end highlights the consequences of his intellectual and political choices. As World War II ravaged Italy, and Mussolini's regime crumbled, Gentile remained loyal to the fascist cause. But in 1944, as Italy fell into chaos, he was assassinated by anti-fascist partisans. The man who had spent his life advocating for national unity and the suppression of dissent met a violent end, a casualty of the very division and conflict he had sought to overcome. As one scholar remarked, Gentile's death was the ultimate irony. He died at the hands of those whose dissent he had spent his life trying to silence. In analyzing Gentile's legacy, it's important to recognize the genuine concerns that drove him to embrace collectivism. He lived in a time of profound instability, where democracy seemed incapable of solving the nation's problems. Yet, his solution, subordinating the individual to the state, proved disastrous. Gentile's life serves as a powerful reminder that the pursuit of unity, when it comes at the expense of personal freedom and diversity of thought, leads to authoritarianism. This critique of collectivism is not an outright rejection of the collective good. Indeed, many modern movements advocating for equal treatment of all people seek to address legitimate concerns. But the lesson of Gentile's life is that unchecked state power, even when motivated by noble goals, can lead to repression. The delicate balance between pursuing the collective good and protecting individual rights must be carefully maintained. The challenge for modern societies is to remain vigilant, to ensure that the pursuit of kindness, security, or national unity does not erode the freedoms that protect individuals from the overreach of the state. Gentile's life is a tragic illustration of what happens when the state becomes too powerful and the individual too weak. His sincere desire for unity led to the suppression of the very freedoms that allow societies to thrive. Today, the battle between individual liberty and the collective good continues, and Gentile's story serves as a cautionary tale for us all. If you found this exploration of Giovanni Gentile thought-provoking, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to War and Wisdom in History. Your support helps us continue bringing these deep dives into historical figures and ideas that have shaped the modern world. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss our next episode as we continue unraveling the legacies of history's most influential thinkers. Stay curious, seek wisdom, and we'll see you in the next chapter of history.